welcome to the OklaRoots YouTube channel, and welcome to Build Your Quilt Top with the OklaRoots Block Party. This method can be used with any quilt top, honestly, but this is specifically for the OklaRoots Block Party. We have our stack of blocks, we have all of our stuff, and now we gotta put it together. So for today, I will be showing you how I add my sashing to my quilt blocks. I will also be showing you how we create a design wall. But first, I'm going to show you how we cut the sashing. Now, I actually did this already in a previous video. However, I decided I'm going to use a different color for my sashing. So since I've got to cut it all up anyways, I figured I might as well show you again in a place where it kind of makes more sense. Also, in that video, I might have told you the wrong number of shortcuts to make, so we're going to remedy that today. You just have to make 5 more. You should have the material if you already cut it. Instead of 25 small sashing cuts, you need 30. We'll go over it. It's fine. So if you've already finished all your quilt blocks, thank you so much for joining along in the quilt along. It was so much fun. I absolutely love it. This is such a treasure of a quilt to me. You don't have to add sashing. You can just put them all together. I always like to create a design wall first. Now you can do this on a bed, on a floor. I like to put it actually up on a wall. So I'm going to show you how I do that after we cut out the sashing. So the main things I'll be using in today's tutorial are my stack of quilt blocks. So remember, we did 12 months. We did 3 blocks every month. So we have 36 quilt blocks. I'm going to arrange this in a square. So it's going to be 6, 6, 6, 6 rows. 6 columns, 6 rows. So here are my quilt blocks. I also have my fabric for my sashing. Now you're going to need at least 2 yards of fabric for your sashing and borders if you're going to do it like I'm doing it. I honestly have a bolt. You don't need a bolt of fabric. However, if you make a lot of quilts, like for me, I used to especially make a ton of quilts, and I pretty much always use the same background color or the same sashing color. And for me, that is the Bella Solids Fog. I love this color. It's not white, it's not gray, it's not beige, it's just nice. It's just a nice neutral color. Everything looks good on it. So at least 2 yards of your sashing backing fabric. You can use scraps. You can make it very, very scrappy. That would be fantastic. Since we're making a quilt wall, I'm also going to be using batting. Now this is the same batting I will be using when I quilt my quilt. I got a king size thing of batting. You don't need this big. Now the finished quilt with the sashing and everything, which is pretty big, is 74 inches by 74 inches. The king size is 120 inches by 120 inches. This is big. You don't need this big. You need it to be bigger than 74 by 74. You need it to be bigger. Don't forget that. The batting needs to be bigger than your quilt top. But this is what I have, so this is what I'm going to use. So this is an all-natural cotton batting. I think that's fantastic. To be completely honest, I usually prefer a bamboo batting. Wool battings are very popular, but be careful. I have used wool battings before, and it was beautiful, and then we washed it, and the batting actually shrunk to about 1/4 of its size inside my quilt. It was a mess. It was a mess, guys. I had to unpick an entire quilt. It was a mess. So I would stick with something like this. This all-natural cotton batting is fine. Bamboo batting is my favorite. I just don't happen to have any on hand right now. The other materials I'll be using today just to construct the sashing are some needles and thread. I like to use Aurifil 50 weight thread and Universal Schmetz 7010 needles. So if you're new to the OklaRoots channel, please consider clicking subscribe down below. If at any point you like this video, please give it a like. Any questions, comments, anything you want to say, leave them down in the comment section. The way that I build my quilt top is just piece by piece. I piece a few pieces together, I put it back on my wall, and then I figure out what I'm doing. That's how I do my quilt tops. There are a lot of other ways to do this though. So I will not be showing you a quilt as you go method. I know a few of you guys asked me to do that. I'm not going to be doing that. I will look for some videos for you and link them down in the description of this video. There's also a really, really great way to piece together these big quilt tops that need to be in a specific order. Susie Quilts shows how to do that perfectly. I will do my best to find a video. She shows you how to do this all the time on her Instagram. So I'm going to search and try to find some of her tutorials showing you how to put together all of this in a really lovely way and then just sew it together. She's a master at that. I am not as talented in doing that. I have tried it. It did not work for me. But a lot of people swear by that method. So I'm going to link her down in the description as well. If you have any other suggestions, leave them down in the comments section. Make sure you drop links to tutorials, websites, whatever, so that everybody who visits this video has a good resource on other methods to do this. As always, just like with all the quilt blocks, I'm just showing you how I like to do it, but you might have a different preference, so make sure you check down below to see some other options. All right, guys, let's get started. All right, so the first thing I want to do is prep my sashing. Now, I'm using regular quilt cotton. This is 42 inches with the fabric, so end to end it's 42 inches. I have it folded in half so that I can cut, it double, which makes it a little bit easier. So first I'm gonna start with the pieces of sashing that are gonna go vertically between my quilt blocks. I'm gonna actually need 30 cuts, and each cut is 10.5 inches tall by 2.5 inches wide. To do that, I'm gonna cut 8 strips of sashing here. Each one is going to be 2.5 inches wide by width of fabric, so 42 inches by 2.5 inches wide. I'm just gonna run through this real quick. If your fabric is really wrinkly, you can just grab your iron and iron it down. You'll notice I'm not too picky about it. I probably should be more picky, but it's my quilt. But if you want it to get nice and straight, just grab your iron and iron this down first. But I'm just going to cut these strips. So to do that, I'm using a 6-inch by 24-inch long ruler. I'm going to line up my 2.5 inch grid mark on the raw edge of my cut fabric. I already cut a piece already to get a nice straight line here. Here we go. This might be a little bit easier to see on a darker cutting mat. So let me get my fabric laid out. And what I'm checking when I do this is that this edge right here is straight, and that my grid marks line up with the folded edge, whichever side has the folded edge. So I'm gonna go over to 2.5 inches on the side, and then I'm gonna take one of my grid marks up here on the top and just make sure it lines up. So if you get to a point where one is straight but the other is really twisted, that means you're gonna need to trim that down. And we'll probably get to that point and I'll show you. So first strip, 2.5 inches by width of fabric. Here we go, there's one. So now I'm just gonna do 8 of these. So now I'm getting to the point where if I want this top grid mark to be lined up with the folded edge, then I have a pretty big discrepancy right here, a big angle. So what I'm gonna do is just line up my ruler along this top folded edge, and then I'm going to make sure it's nice and straight and that the top piece here that's a little wonky goes off the side. And then I'm just gonna use my rotary cutter to square this up, get it nice and straight. Throw away that piece, and then I'll continue on. So now when I line up my edge and my top, it should all be nice and squared up. So now I have my 8 pieces of sashing here. What I like to do real quick is actually press these just real fast, because I'm gonna be stacking them and cutting them together. It's easier if they're all nice and straight. So you just wanna make sure they stay folded and you keep the long edges lined up. So I just very gently lay them out, spread them, make sure they're lined up, and then I can just lay it to the side over here. So I'll do this for all of them. Okay, so once these are all nice and straight, I'm going to grab 2 strips at a time. So remember, they're still folded. And I'm just gonna lay them right on top of each other, lining up the folded edges and the raw edges. There we go, and get them as lined up as possible. Now I'm going to take my 12-inch by 6-inch ruler, and first thing I'm gonna do is cut off this selvage on the end so that you can see this kind of like a rough edge over here. I'm just gonna cut that off so I have a nice clean end here. And now I'm gonna cut down these strips to 10.5 inches long. So I'm just gonna line up my ruler. Everything should be squared up nicely. There we go. And I'm gonna cut 10.5 inch strip. So there's 4. Should be able to get another one out of this. There we go. And that's 8. So each one of these strips will give you 4 sashing units. So we're gonna do this for all 8 strips. So we should have 32 in the end. We should have more than we need, but I'm just gonna once again double them up. It's easiest if I cut 2 at a time. If you're having trouble cutting this, you might need a new rotary blade. If you have a good rotary blade and everything is nice and lined up, this should be fairly easy. But if it's not, if it's very challenging, then just do one at a time. You don't have to layer them like this. This is quicker for me, but it might not be quicker for you if it's hard. Okay, so now you should have a stack of sashing. Like I said, you should have 30 of these cuts. Each of them are 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches. Go ahead and put these to the side. Okay, next we're gonna work on the sashing. That's going to be the horizontal sashing. Now this is gonna go below the blocks. So instead of individual cuts, we're gonna have long strips. We're gonna have 5 long strips. Each of these strips is going to be 2.5 inches by 70.5 inches long. In order to accomplish that, I am going to cut more width of fabric strips, so the width of the fabric at 2.5 inches wide. I'm gonna cut 9 cuts this time, and then we'll sew it all together and then cut it down to the size we need. So just like before, cut your strips of fabric 2.5 inches. Doing your best to keep it all as straight as possible. If you need to square up your long edge here on the side, go ahead and do that. So just like we did with the shorter sashing, I'm going to press each of these strips, and I'm just, again, very lightly. I'm keeping them folded in half. I just want them to be as straight as possible. It's not the biggest deal in the world because honestly we're going to be sewing these all together, but it helps. Okay, once I have all of these pressed, the first thing I want to do is cut off the raw edges on each of them. So you can stack them up again just like you did before. We're going to sew all of these pieces together, but first we want to make sure we remove the raw edges. So once again, I'm just going to grab my ruler and my rotary cutter and just go right up to where the selvage starts and trim it down. Repeat this for all of them. Okay, once you have them all cleaned up and ready to go, what we want to do is sew each of these strips together. So if you're using a solid like I am, it's a little tricky to tell which side is the right side. Honestly, a solid like this, they're both the right side. If you're using a print, you can easily see the right side and the wrong side. So you're going to grab one strip and then separate it. We don't need it folded anymore. And lay it right side up. Grab another strip and then take one of the shorter edges and lay it right side down, okay? Or so you can lay them next to each other like this, but you want it right side down, and we're gonna twist it so that it's at a 90-degree angle, just like that. And then what you do is you draw a diagonal from the top left corner of your top fabric to the bottom right corner of your bottom fabric. So we're just drawing a diagonal to connect these two pieces together. There we go. Now, to be completely honest, you could also just sew them blunt edge to blunt edge together and open. It just creates kind of a bulky seam. This creates a little bit smoother of a seam. So once we have that in place, I'm going to add a couple pins to both sides just to hold it in place. Okay, so now I'm actually going to go ahead and do this for the entire strip. So now that I have this strip right here, remember this is the wrong side, so I want to flip this over so I have the right side up. This is where you can make mistakes. I've done it a million times, guys. But you want to make sure you have the right side of your strip up, just like that. Grab another strip of fabric, open it up, and lay this strip right side down. So again, right side to right side on the corner. Lay it perpendicular just like you did before. Draw your diagonal from the top left edge to the bottom right corner from that bottom fabric. And then pin these together just so they stay in place. And then, before you move, take this top fabric and flip it so you have right side up. Because what happens is you forget to do that, and then you end up doing wrong side to right side, and you have seams on one side, seams on the other side. It's a mess. Again, I've done it so many times, but just continue on with this, remembering always right sides together. Right sides together. Easy to do if you're using a print. A little bit more challenging if you're using a solid. Okay, so once you have all the pieces pinned together and marked, now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and we're just going to stitch right over each of our marked lines. As I go along, I like to just double check that it's the right side. You know, you don't have seams on one side and then on the other side as well. Just do your best to keep it all nice and straight. We're just gonna have one very long piece of fabric and we're gonna leave it like that until it's time to add it to the quilt top. Okay, here we go, all sewn together. So now I'm just gonna go one at a time and pull them apart. Ooh, what a mess. So I'm just going to check this. So I'm gonna disconnect the thread between this, pull out the pins, and this will be just like that. That's good, okay? So I'm not even going to cut this down yet or press it. I'm just going through this. If you left your pins in, just be careful as you do this. So this is right side. I'm going to keep the right side up as I go through. Still the right side, good. And I'm just going to continue going along my sashing. And really what I'm checking here is just to make sure that the seam is on the right side each time. So I'm clipping the threads that connected it since I kind of chain sewed it over there. If you sewed a couple of these the wrong sides together, you want to catch it now, because it'll be easier to fix rather than catching it when you're attaching it to the rows on your quilt. Okay, so now we can go along once we've confirmed all the seams are good, and we can just trim down the seam allowance. Now you can use a rotary cutter and your ruler if you'd like, or you can just kind of eyeball it. I'm trimming this down to 1/4 inch away from my stitches, just getting this little bit off. So do this for all of your seams. Okay, once this is trimmed down, what I'm going to do now is just go to each of these seams, and I'm actually going to press this seam open. So I'm just going to use my fingers and go on the back side, open up that seam, and press it with my iron. Just going to do this for all of them. So once you have this the way you want it, I'm just going to gently fold this up. You can see that it starts to kind of fray along the edges when you mess with it too much. So I really don't want to do anything else with this right now. I just want to put it to the side until I'm ready to use it. So I am just kind of folding, rolling it. And this is my horizontal sashing. So the next cut, if you choose to use it, it's completely optional, are the borders. Now this is going to go around the final quilt top on the top and on the sides. The borders just give it a nice look, and it gives the binding something to wrap around on so it doesn't cover any of your quilt blocks. But again, it's completely optional. I already have a cut for the borders in a different color fabric. You're gonna make this the exact same way you made the horizontal sashing. They're gonna be 2.5 inches long, except for the borders, you only need 8 strips of fabric cut instead of 9 strips. So now I'm going to grab my batting and some of this tape, which is very, very sticky, and I'm going to tape my batting to my wall. So now what I'm gonna try to do is put up my batting on a wall. So this is my batting, this is my tape, and that's my wall. This is gonna be 74 inches high when finished. I'm 5'4". 64 inches, so I just gotta have about 10 inches more. Now the thing is that this is not sewn together. So when sewn together, it's going to be about 74 inches high. Unsewn, it's gonna be bigger than that. So I'm just going to tape a big old piece of batting to this wall behind me so that I can stick my quilt blocks up on it and get an idea of how I want all this laid out, since it's a pretty big size. Remember, this batting is much, much larger than it needs to be. Much, much larger than it needs to be. I don't suggest getting one that's this big. You will see I struggle with it. I really should have bought some batting for this tutorial. Okay, let's get it. Whoops. Oh no. Don't you come down over there. I see you trying to come down. Oh no, my nail came off. I'm quickly losing control of this. Okay, so the goal on this is to get it as straight as possible. I will tell you that because it is so big, this is why I'm having a problem with it right now. If it wasn't so big, it wouldn't be so heavy. And it did get, I've little bits of batting all over my face, but it's okay. We can do this. You could also get a big insulation board. So they have these really big insulation boards at Lowe's, Home Depot, things like that. You can wrap that in batting and then use that as your design wall. You can just lay it on a bed or on your floor, honestly. I like design walls because, especially if I'm going to be working on a project that's going to take me weeks, months, I like to have a wall up so that I can slowly just keep picking at it and not have to like put it away, take it out, put it away, take it out every time, I'm gonna go to bed. That should be mostly fine. So now that we have that, now that we have the wall up, what I'm gonna do is take all my quilt blocks and I'm just going to kind of randomly start laying them out, moving them around, getting them in a design that I really like. I'm not so worried about the sashing right now. I'll deal with that later. I'll leave a little bit of a gap between each quilt block, but the sashing I'm not really gonna put up on the wall because that's a lot to keep up there. I'm just worried about my quilt blocks. What I'm doing now is I'm counting to make sure I have 6 across because it's gonna be 6 on the top, 6 down, rows of 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I need one more. All right, there we go. So now I'm just gonna continue on putting up the blocks in a somewhat random order. There you go, now you guys can see it a little bit better. But I'm not too concerned about how straight or level they are right now. Remember, I'm not sewing them onto the batting. I'm just kind of getting a general idea of how I want the layout to be. And you can see with the batting, all I have to do is just press on it and it sticks to it really nicely. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of move around the blocks. So for example, I want this like red cross block to be in the middle of my quilt because this really symbolizes the last 12 months for me. The red cross, helping so many people, the masks, all of that. So I want that up here and I want that right next to my heart block with all of the kids in it because this was a big year too for inclusion, for celebrating diversity. So I have these 2 blocks that are probably my 2 favorite blocks from the year right in the middle. And I'll put another heart block down here. All right, there we go. So now I'm gonna stand back and just kind of look at it. Honestly, I'm not very picky when it comes to block layouts. I really like this. I think this looks great. So now before we move on, I'm actually gonna take a picture really quick of this layout because we're gonna be taking these down, sewing them, putting them back up, taking them down, sewing. We're gonna be moving them around a lot and I wanna remember my layout because I will forget. So I'm gonna take a picture of this real quick. So actually, as I'm taking a picture of this, I see I have a lot of like yellow in this one spot down here. So I'm gonna switch this around a little bit. I don't really want groups of colors, bunching up in one area. I think I'll also switch my houses because this is pink, this is more green. Let's get that. I just want to spread out all of the different colors all over the place. Okay, so now we have the layout all done. I took a picture of it to make sure I don't forget which way everything goes. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna add our sashing. Now this is our vertical sashing. These are the shorter cuts. They are going to be added to the right side of every single quilt block except the quilt blocks on the farthest right column. So these quilt blocks right here do not get a vertical piece of sashing added to them at all. We're just gonna leave these alone. I'm gonna actually take down all the rest of the quilt blocks and on the right side of every single one of them, I'm going to attach one of these strips. So if you're worried about losing your layout or getting too much of a confusing mess with all this, what we can do is we can do row by row. So for the first row, I'm gonna just focus on that. I'm gonna stitch on the vertical sashing on the right side of the first 5 blocks on the top row. And then I'm going to stitch together all 6 blocks and just completely form my top row. I'll then continue this for the rest of the rows. So now all we have to do is add this sashing to the right side of each block. So I'm just going to take my sashing, take my block, lay them right sides together on the right side. They should be the same height. And then I'll just pin them together just like this. Now remember, when you were building your blocks, ideally we wanted them to be 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches. If they were just a little bit less than 10.5 inches, you'll find that they're not quite as long as your sashing cut. And if it's just a bit, just a little bit, like 1/8 of an inch, that's okay. But if your blocks are significantly shorter, like less than 1/4 of an inch on each side, then they're not going to get caught in the seam allowance, and that's a problem. So what you can do, if you notice all of your blocks are smaller, is just change your sashing to about 10 inches high, or however high you want your blocks to be. Maybe your blocks need to be 10.25 inch by 10.25 inch. You can adjust this however you'd like. Just make sure you keep it trimmed up and clean as you work, and then it will all come together okay. So I'm just going to go along and attach the sashing on the right side of each of my 5 quilt blocks from my top row. Now let's take these to the sewing machine and sew along these 5 edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, once you have them sewed on, now we're just going to press the seams. So I'm going to press the seam behind the sashing because it's easier. So I'm going to give it one press on the front. Remember, I'm using a dry iron, no steam here. Give it a gentle finger press and then press along that edge. There we go. And then you can give it a quick press on the back as well. Go ahead and repeat this with all your quilt blocks. So remember, I suggested taking a picture of your quilt when it was all laid out on your wall or your bed, wherever you have it laid out, just so you remember the layout. This is where it comes in handy. So I know my first block is this black heart here, and then my second block is this one right here. So starting with these two, I'm going to lay them right sides together, lining up the unsashed edge of my second block with the sashing on my first block. So obviously I'm just putting the sashing in between them, right? So line them up, right sides together, and then just pin along this side. Let's go ahead and do the same thing with the third and fourth blocks, always making sure your sashings are in between the blocks. You don't want sashing to sashing and then have it all wonky, unless you do, in which case I bet that looks awesome. Lay them right sides together and pin in place. So then you should have your 5th quilt block here with the sashing in place. Then you're going to go grab your 6th quilt block that we left on the design wall because it did not get a sashing. And we're going to take that and line up the left edge of that block with the sashing edge and lay them right sides together and pin together. Now we can take these 3 pinned units to the sewing machine and sew along these edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, once again, I'm going to press the seam behind the sashing. So now we just need to put the entire row together. So grab your blocks 1 and 2 and lay those right side up. And then grab your unit with blocks 3 and 4, and we're going to lay this right side down so that block 3 will be able to connect to the sashing on block 2. Let's just pin this really well together. I like to make sure my bottom and top edges are also lined up. And now, just to make this quicker, I'm also going to pin on my blocks 5 and 6. So I'm going to fold back my block 4 so that it's right side up, just like that. And then I'm going to take my block 5 and 6 unit, and then I'm going to take the raw edge of my block 5, lay it right side down on that sashing. So this way, at the sewing machine, I can do both of these back to back, and it just saves me a little bit of time. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew along both of my pinned edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Alright, and just like we did the previous times, let's press those seams. And I'm just going to press them once again behind the sashing. You'll notice that, especially if you're using sashing, this is getting pretty long. So it's not, it's not a small quilt top. Just do your best to go slow and hold everything in place while you're sewing. I know mine likes to slip off the edge of the table, and that kind of pulls on the needle, and then I can get some kind of wonky stitches. Just go really slow, hold it together. Okay, so now we have one row done. I'm gonna go ahead and attach it to the very top, and I want you to see how much shorter it is once it's all sewn together. But we do have the sashing on too, so it might actually not be that much shorter than it is up on the wall. It's actually not shorter. Ignore that. Now I'm gonna repeat this process for the next 5 rows so that I have each of my 6 rows complete and ready to go. After that, we'll add in the horizontal sashing so that we have a completed quilt top. Okay, so as you can see, we are on day 2 now of Operation Quilt Top. I lost my light yesterday, so we had to just stop at the rows. So as you can see, I did all 6 rows. They're all ready to go. I will be honest with you, this whole quilt wall, it came down last night. I have a couple of kittens that decided that this was going to be their climbing wall, and this morning it was all over the floor. So just a heads up, if you do a quilt wall and you've got kittens, maybe shut a door. So now what we want to do is we want to put the bottom border sashing on 5 of these rows. So we're going to do the top 5 rows, and we're going to leave the bottom row completely unsashed because I will be adding a border around the entire finished quilt top. So the border will count as like the sashing for that bottom row. So we're just going to add this sashing to the top 5 rows. Remember, this sashing is very long. It's just one long piece of fabric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just line it up on the bottom edge of the top row first. Once I have it all pinned down, I'll then cut it to the size I need it. Now I cut it just a little bit bigger. I leave a little bit of overhang on both ends because it's better to have a little bit extra than not enough. So I'll leave a little bit of overhang on both ends, cut it, stitch it down, press it, and just continue on for the other rows. So I'm going to show you how I do it on the first row, and then we'll just kind of speed through to get through the rest of the rows. So first we need to take down our top row without taking down the whole quilt wall. Whew, we did it. So as you can see, I have my top row of my quilt top, and now I have my sashing. I'm going to take my sashing and I'm going to lay it right side down. Now you might have to actually go a little bit farther if you're using a solid, just to remember which side is the right side. So I'm going to lay this right side down, and I'm going to let it overhang over here on the left anywhere between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. I would go on the smaller side just in case your sashing isn't quite long enough for all of the rows. You should be okay. And once I have the bottom edge of my quilt top row and the bottom edge of my sashing lined up, I'm just going to add pins along this entire bottom edge here. Try not to, pull too much. Keep it as straight and flat as possible. I'm assuming for you as well, your row is longer than your table. So I just let it overhang on both sides as I'm going down. Make sure when you come across your seam that your seam is facing up towards you for your sashing. That should remind you that that is the back of your sashing, which is what we want. We want to be seeing the back side of our sashing here. Okay, so once I get towards the end, I'm just going to pin this completely on. And then I'm going to grab my rotary cutter, and I'm just going to cut it about 1/4 inch away from the edge, just like that. So I have a little bit of overhang, and I can trim that down later. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and sew along this edge at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll be honest, the scant thing here is not that big of a deal. So if you're doing an actual 1/4 inch seam allowance, that's going to be fine for these strips versus, these little tiny blocks. It's going to be okay here. Okay, once we have that stitched on, all we have to do is iron it. So we're just going to iron it the way we always iron our blocks and our sashings. We're going to just press it with it folded right sides together first, just to set that seam. Then just finger press that seam open, and I like the seam to go behind the sashing, and I'm just going to go block by block, finger pressing it open and then pressing with my iron. If you have a nice long ironing board here, this is going to be easier for you, but I'm just using this little mat. And just as before, I'm not using any steam. I'm just using a dry iron on the hottest setting, but no steam. There you go. Once you have this pressed on, we can put this back on our wall or wherever you're putting your quilt, and then we're going to repeat this for the next 4 rows. Remember, we're not adding this to the very bottom row. After we have these on the next 4 rows, then we're just going to put the whole quilt top together. So I'm just going to real quick put these on to the other 4 rows. So as you can see, I put that first row up on the design wall. If you don't want to use a design wall anymore, you don't have to. We're at a point now where we just have 6 rows, so you could just number each one of them and then lay them down anywhere and you'll be fine. You don't need the design wall anymore. I'm going to keep it up because I put in a lot of work to get it up there, but as I build the quilt top, I will take down the design wall. So I've got my second row. I'm going to attach the sashing to the bottom of this one, and I'm going to continue doing that for the other 3 rows below it. Remember, I'm not adding sashing to the very bottom row. So now that we have all of the rows done, the sashing on all the rows is done, the quilt blocks are all rowed up, good to go. We now have 6 rows and we just have to sew them all together. So I'm going to show you how I sew each one together to try to keep it as lined up as possible. Now, to be completely honest, some of these vertical sashings row by row are not going to line up perfectly, but we're going to do our best, and in the end, you're not going to notice a little bit of a discrepancy. So first, let's grab the first row and the second row, take that over to the table, and get it all pinned together. So here is our row number 1, and what I want to do first is find the middle of this. So I have 3 blocks on each side. This right here is my middle. Now, it's always good if you lay out your rows how you want them in the end, just to get a better idea. So here's my row number 2. I'm going to line it up just beneath it. Again, let's see, 1, 2, 3. So this is my 3rd block. So this is my middle of row number 2. And we're going to start pinning in the middle of the rows first and move out towards the sides. So I'm going to take my second row and I'm just going to flip it up right sides together. So the top of row number 2 should be on the bottom of row number 1, just like this. And then what you're going to do is you're just going to kind of fold this up, and you're trying to make sure that the sashing here lines up with the sashing on row number 1. So I just kind of line it up like that as best I can and then put it down. Make sure it lines up with the bottom edge of the sashing. Remember, you're lining up the top edge of row number 2 with the bottom edge of the sashing. So now I'm just going to slowly move my way to the right, and then I'll move my way to the left. And as I'm going, I'm kind of flipping up row number 2, and I'm doing my best to keep the vertical sashing lined up with the vertical sashing on row number 1. Like I said, if it's not perfect, that's okay, but if you focus on this, so I focus on that sashing first, pin it, and then I'll pin in between, you have a better chance of getting this to line up the way you want. Versus if you just kind of blindly tug and pin, and then you're going to notice that one row is off to one side and the other row is shorter, and it's kind of a mess. If you just focus on keeping it together at the sashings and then adjust the rest of it, you'll be in pretty good shape. So your row number 2 shouldn't go all the way to your sashing. If your sashing's a little bit longer, it should go, the quilt block edge should come up with the quilt block edge. You can see my sashing over here extends farther. My sashing down here extends farther. I'm not worried about the sashings because I'm going to trim those down. I just want to make sure my quilt block edges line up. There we go. And then I'll just pin it all together. Okay, now I'm gonna move my rows down and work on the left-hand side. So once again, I have my middle here, focused on the sashing first. I'm just gonna kind of stretch it as I can. Now with all these seams in these quilt blocks, you can actually kind of manipulate this just a little bit by a little bit of stretching here and there. Don't warp your rows or anything like that, but you can stretch it a tiny bit if you really need to. And then once again, over here on the far side, I'm just lining up the raw edges of my quilt block. I'm not really paying attention to the horizontal sashing pieces. So I can put a pin up on the top there just to hold it together. And then remember, we're just pinning the bottom edge here. Okay, now let's take this to the sewing machine and just sew it 1/4 inch along this bottom long pinned edge. Alrighty, once you have it stitched together, I like to lay the side that has the sashing that we just stitched with the sashing wrong side up. So this would be row number 1, wrong side up, because I'm going to press the seam behind the sashing. So just like we've been doing, we're going to press the sashing while it's right sides together. And then we're gonna fold row 1 up so the seam stays behind that sashing. Give it a gentle finger press to get it all nice and flat. And then just press it with your iron. And just do this along the entire row that you just stitched together. Okay, once you have these 2 rows sewn together, you can then just grab the 3rd row and add it on here, or you can sew the 3rd and 4th rows together and then the 5th and 6th rows together. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go put this back up on the wall. I'm gonna grab rows 3 and 4, and I'm gonna repeat this process for those 2 rows. So here I have the center of row 3, and then just real quick, right below it, I'm going to lay row 4. I'm going to find the center of row 4, so 1, 2, 3. Okay, this right here will be the center of row 4. And then making sure the top of row 4 is going to go up against the bottom of row 3, I'm just going to turn these right sides together. And just like before, I'm matching up the center sashings between my blocks on 3 and 4. So that way, this will get as centered as possible, and then line up those bottom edges together and then pin in place. And then I'll go out towards the edges, always lining up my sashing first. If there's just no way you can get it lined up as perfectly as you want, that is totally fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. It really doesn't. And then don't forget, once we get towards the edge, I'm most focused on lining up the edges of the quilt blocks. Don't care about the sashing. The sashing is not supposed to line up with the edge because I made my sashing longer than the rows that have my quilt blocks. And then I'm just going to repeat this for the left side of my strips for my quilt. Alrighty, now let's take these rows 3 and 4 to the sewing machine and just sew along the pinned edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It doesn't have to be a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. You'll be fine if you just use a 1/4 inch. Once you have rows 3 and 4 stitched together, let's just do the same thing for rows 5 and 6. And remember, when you add row 6 doesn't have a sashing on the bottom, so you can actually use that to your advantage by taking the bottom edge of your quilt blocks where the vertical sashing is and kind of lining that up with the sashing from row 5, and that will help you get everything nice and straight. All right, once you have all this clipped together, let's take this to the sewing machine and sew along this pinned edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so now we're gonna add all of these doubles of rows together. So since I have rows 5 and 6 already on my table, that's what I'm gonna start with. So let's see, I'm gonna go to the center again. And as this gets bigger, it's going to get a little bit more challenging. So my advice is to take breaks as you need it and go slow. And clean off your table. You're gonna need as much space as possible here. So these are rows 5 and 6. Now I'm gonna go grab my row 3 and 4. So here are my rows 3 and 4. Now I know 3 and 4 are going to go above 5 and 6. So I'm going to take my 3 and 4, lay it right side down and upside down. So the top of my row 3 is down here along the bottom edge of row 6. And then the bottom of row 4 is along the top edge of row 5. And now I'm concerned about this edge right here between rows 4 and 5. And just like before, I'm going to line this all up, starting with the center vertical sashing. Lift this up, make sure my sashing is lined up on both rows 4 and 5, and then line up this bottom edge. And grab my pins and just pin these together. And then once again, I'm going to go to the right side first and straighten this out as I go. I don't have enough space to have this whole thing flat, so I have to kind of mush it around until I get to the spot I'm working on, and that's okay. I only need the space that I'm working on to be flat and straight. Everything else can just go where it needs to go. Okay, so once again, I'm going to roll this up, and I am going to do my best to get this lined up. There we go. I've got my vertical sashing lined up, and then line up the bottom edge here. Again, perfection is not the goal here. Just trying to keep it as straight as possible, but finished is best. Okay, working on the next sashing, and I can tell you right now, the left side of my quilt is just dangling off the table, trying to pull the rest of it down. It gets heavy. It does get a little heavy, so, you know, if you have to do this on the floor, that's fine. If you have to do this, you know, on a bed and you kind of put your cutting mats on top of the bed, just so when you push your pins in, you don't go through the sheets on your bed, that's fine too. Quilters have to get creative when we have big quilts like this. Okay, and just like before, I'm gonna line up that bottom edge, and then I'm gonna line up the sides of my quilt blocks. I'm not worried about that sashing over here, because that is longer than it needs to be. There we go. Now I'm gonna repeat this for the left side. Okay, once we have that edge all pinned together, let's take it to the sewing machine and sew along it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so now we have the top of row 3 centered on the mat. So rows 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all sewn together. You should be able to kind of drape it over your table and take a really nice look at it. Get all those good feels. I love a quilt top when it's draped over the table and it's like, wow, that's so pretty. Okay, so now let's grab the set of rows 1 and 2. And then let's just find the center on the bottom of row 2. So 1, 2, 3, here we go. So this sashing right here is the center. This is the center of my row 3. So remember, rows 1 and 2 will go above it, and then just flip it right side down. So the bottom edge of row 2 is up towards the top edge of row 3. Your quilt should be getting pretty big now if you're using this sashing. Fold it up, center your sashings, and then line up this bottom edge here. And we're just gonna pin these rows together. Okay, once you have this all pinned together, let's go take it to the sewing machine and sew along the pinned edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So as you can see, I'm taking the left edge of my quilt and I'm pushing it up because it's so heavy. What it does, it starts pulling on it over to the side. And then that makes my seam all wonky. So I just keep tugging it up and pushing it up on the table. Okay, I know this is big. I know it's a big quilt top. It's a good one though. This is a snuggling quilt, guys. This is a nice big one that the whole family can snuggle under. I like big quilts. Let's go ahead and press that seam behind the last of our sashings. After this, all we have to do is add borders if you want. It's totally optional. You don't have to add any borders at all. You can be done if you like. All right, the center part of your quilt is now done. Let's go ahead and trim off these edges a little bit. So we want the sides to be as straight as possible. For the most part, you should be good except for your sashing. So I'm just gonna lay it flat on one side, grab a ruler, and I'm just gonna line up the edges of the quilt blocks and trim down that sashing. And that should give us a nice straight edge here. So let's just go down and do this with all of the sashings. Especially if you're going to be adding on the borders, you want to get this as straight as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, it really doesn't, but get it as straight as you possibly can. Get any noticeable big bumps, you know, obviously like the sashing. Let's just get those out of the way. So this is where we're at. If you don't want borders, you are done. You can go ahead and put this to the side and we will come back to this and we will quilt it and bind it and all that good stuff. You're totally done with your quilt top. If you're gonna add borders like I am, let's continue on with that. Now the borders are gonna be added very similar to how the sashing is added. First, you need to determine if you made a long piece of border sashing like I did. So see, this is my border sashing right here. It's just a nice long strip of fabric. Do you want to attach the sides first and then the top and bottom? Or do you want to attach the top and bottom first and then the sides? It really doesn't matter, but if you have a very particular look with your seams and everything, go ahead and think about that. I am going to attach the top and bottom first and then I'll attach the sides. So let's go ahead and get our quilt top nice and flat. So I'm just going to pull it down and I am only working on this top edge right here. And I don't have to start in the center for this. I can start on the side. We actually want to start on the side. Here is my border fabric and I need to find which side is the right side. So I'm looking for this seam right here. There we go. So that's the right side. So I went right side down. Just like before, I'm going to let it overhang on the left side by about 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to pin the sashing to the top of my quilt top. All right, once you get all the way to the end, just like before, I'm going to just trim down this sashing on the right side here to about 1/4 inch longer than the top edge of my quilt top. And now, just to save some time, let's go ahead and add the sashing to the bottom edge as well. So the top edge is already pinned together. Now I'm just going to add the sashing to the bottom side the exact same way. All right, so just like on the top edge, I'm just going to trim this down so it's just a little bit bigger than my quilt top. Okay, so I have the border for the bottom and the border for the top pinned onto my quilt top. I'm now going to take this to the sewing machine and sew along both of these pinned edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. there we go. We have our top and bottom borders on. So we're going to press the seam behind the borders just like we did with the sashing. So I'm just going to press the seam with both fabrics right sides together first. And then you can just push up that border and finger press it. And then use your iron to gently press that seam behind the border strip. Okay, once you have one border pressed, just rotate your block and do the same thing on the other border. Once we have that all ironed, now let's just trim down our top border and our bottom border on the sides. If you had it extend further like I did, we just want this to be nice and straight, so that'll make it easier to attach the side borders. Just make sure you get all 4 corners. All right, so we have the top and bottom borders on. Now let's rotate our quilt block and we're gonna attach the side borders. So I know this is pretty big. I just kind of scrunch it all up on one side, just don't worry about it. So I'm gonna grab my roll of sashing here, that's for my border, and I'm going to line it up on the top left corner over here, and then I'll just pin it along the entire edge. And then I'm just going to cut this down just a bit past the edge of my quilt. There we go. Now let's attach the rest of this to the other side of our quilt top. All right, there we go. Now let's just take this to the sewing machine and sew along both of the side borders at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, those were your final stitches for your quilt top. Congratulations, you made a quilt top. That's amazing. Okay, so now let's just press the seam behind these side borders. I know this thing is big and it's just like pulling on you in every which way. It's hanging off the table. I know, I'm in the same position. I know, it's worth it. I know it's hard, but it's worth it. Once you have one side done, go ahead and repeat that for the other side. Just get this border nice and flat. And then just to finish this up so you don't have to do it later, let's go ahead and square up these corners. So that just means whatever overhang you have over here, let's trim it down. You should be in pretty good shape since we've been keeping this trimmed down while we were constructing it. We just go around all 4 corners, trim down any overhang you have. All right, you should take a few days to make this quilt top. Don't try to do it all in a day, just don't. I gotta tell you, I got a pain in the top of my back that hurts so bad because I just tried to get it done really fast for the sake of this tutorial. But when you're making your quilt top, give yourself some time and maybe put your quilt wall up in a room where you have a door that you can shut so your cats don't rip it down. But here is our quilt top. You can't see it. It's a big one, guys. It's so big. Ooh, look at that. It is just such a beautiful, beautiful quilt. I am blown away by this. Look how pretty that is. Look at how pretty and colorful it is. If you did it super scrappy, you should be really pleased with how beautiful and colorful this is. I hope that this quilt means the world to you. I really do. I hope that you love this quilt. This quilt means so, so much to me. I can't even tell you. I mean, I've tried to tell you every single month for the last year. I've tried to tell you how much this quilt means to me, but it really does. This is my COVID quilt. I don't really know how much I like saying that, but it is my quilt that really walks through a year that I'll never forget, a year that will go down in history for all of us, and a very significant year. A very significant year is documented in this quilt right here. So thank you so much for being a part of this journey with me. Stay tuned. We're going to have another video going over how to make a quilt sandwich, which is where we take the backing and the batting and the top and we put it all together. And then we're going to have another video where we quilt it. And finally, a video where we bind it. And I'll give you lots of options each time. I know some of you guys are interested in hiring out the quilting to someone, because if this seemed like a lot, you might be like, you know what, I'm done after this. I just want to have somebody else take care of the rest. I'll give you guys some tips in the next video and some recommendations on where you can find someone to help you with that. Thank you so much for quilting along with me, for being a part of this journey. No matter what year you're making this, if you're making this years from now, or if you're making it in February and March of 2021 with me, I hope that you'll love it. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a great day. Have a fantastic rest of the week. Get out there and make something. Bye.